Alright, very welcome to the chapter about intermediate moves. Intermediate moves, that's a very important part of the tactical battle in general. We can rely on this idea both when attacking and when defending, obviously, in any situation, in the opening, in the middle game, in the end game. Here I'm mainly interested in looking at this idea from a defensive perspective. What is then intermediate moves about? Well, there can be different definitions. In my opinion, it's something like a move that we would like to carry out before another move. So we insert this move, and together with the opponent's reply, something will change in the position. There will be some kind of difference which will favor us later on. And for this to happen, obviously, the intermediate move itself, it needs to be of a forcing nature. It must be a move that really limits the opponent's choices, because else, obviously, they could play something completely different and we might not be able to carry out our intended move, so to speak. So for this reason, I would say among these forcing moves, we should consider three kinds of moves: checks, captures, and threats. Well, in a way, you could say that check is also a threat, right? It's a threat directed at the king. But anyway, these three groups I think are very useful, not only for intermediate moves, but also for chess tactics in general. I'm saying checks, captures, and threats, typical candidate moves, so to speak. So let's have a look at some examples where the defending side used intermediate moves in order to improve their chances. We will start with some cases where we were using a check for this purpose. So let's start with this educational example. I don't remember really how I got in touch with this example. Somehow I think I based myself on some game, some student's game perhaps, and this is the position that we're looking at. Let's see if we can understand this. We have the black pieces, we're having the black pieces, and we're a piece down. White has an extra bishop, and at the same time we can see that our rook is under attack, but so is white's rook. So what's going on here? What should black do about this? Well, we could of course take their rook, but in that case they will take ours, and we will remain a piece down. Let's go back, and let's see if we can do something before we take that rook. Well, this is a simple example, so I'm sure that you have already noticed what black should do. That's right. We have an intermediate check at our disposal here. We can play queen e5. My piece of advice is that even if you're not sure what's going on, what this move would be good for, you should check it. Whenever you have such a check at your disposal, you should have a look at it, because it might make a big difference. So black's best move here, queen e5, because it turns out that unfortunately, no matter how white reacts, there will be some kind of difference here in the position. So if they play queen g3, as you can see, now they're not attacking our rook anymore, and we could safely take theirs. So for this reason, they will have to move the king instead. King d1, and we can safely take the rook because, well, you can see the difference, right? Now the king is on g1 instead of h2 as before. And this means that they are running the risk of a fork here. And that's what will happen, of course. Aha, you got it. Queen a1, and we pick up the bishop next turn. As simple as that. If we look at this again, black could take immediately, but in that case, white will take back on e2, and we don't have any fork here. And that's working. I mean, we could perhaps play this and take the pawn, but that's a different kind of fork. You can see that in this case, also white will have chances for an attack, and they will be still material up. So this doesn't really work, but if we include the move queen e5, it's a different story, because now white is forced to either move away their queen, or they will have to put the king on the first rank. What does that mean? Well, in the first place, you might think that, nice, I can play rook e1, but in that case, white would play rook f1. So that's not the idea. The idea is rather that now when we take back, suddenly their king and bishop are prone to this fork on a1. All right, let's continue. Let's look at something slightly more difficult. This is a game which was played in the online Chess Olympiad a few years ago, playing with the white pieces Grandmaster Bogner and playing black Lim. As you can see, again, similar material relation. White is a piece up, but black is having some counterplay. We can see that for starters, there is the threat of queen takes b2. So what do you think? How should we deal with this threat? Could we somehow defend this bishop in a good way? That's right. We should use an intermediate move here in order to improve our defenses. If we defend the bishop straight away using the queen, well, in that case, as you can see, black would have this cheap tactic. Rook takes b2, and after queen takes b2, queen d3, the rook on f1 is hanging. How can we then use this intermediate check? Which check are we talking about? Well, there are a few different checks, right? We can give check on f7, we could give check on f8, but in that case, black could move up, and it's not clear what does white gain from this. I think in the game, actually, this happened, and they agreed on a draw here. I think white was in big time trouble, because else they would have discovered another check. Aha, you're right. Maybe the difficulty with this case is that there are so many checks. So the more choices we have in general in chess, the more difficult it can be to find a solution, even if it's comparatively a simple solution as here. So you're right, of course. We should give the check on c8. Why is that? Well, because on the next turn, we can bring our queen to c2, and this time we're giving check. So we win a whole tempo, so to speak. Obviously, in a tactical situation like this, a whole tempo, that's a lot. So after king g8, or whatever black would play here, as you can see, now we are ready to play something regarding this threat of rook takes b2. You can solve this problem in different ways. Perhaps the simplest one would just be to put the king on a1, so that if black takes, they would not give check on d3 anymore. So here basically white would be winning because they have a material advantage, and also black's king is much weaker. So a simple example how we can use this intermediate check on c8 to bring our queen with check to c2. This means that once the queen arrives here, we win a tempo thanks to the check at black's king. And now you could move your rook somewhere. Yeah, don't put it on d1, please, because then black will take here, but you could put it on e1, for example. Or you could play, as we just said, you could play here king a1. That's another good choice. So simple usage of intermediate checks. The queens, by the way, are very good with this task. Let's check a next example. This is from the endgame instead. We have with the white pieces Puranik and playing black Keith Arkell. As you can see, white is pushing in this endgame. Black is having difficulties. They're a pawn down, and also white has this dangerous passed pawn. So it's really time for black to look at their different options here. We could perhaps start with what we did in the previous chapter. We should try to establish what is white's main threat here. And as you can see, there are at least two very serious threats here. One would be to play c7, trying to queen the pawn because the king is busy defending the knight on e5. And another idea, perhaps for white, would be to give this check on d5. This is also troublesome for black because if the king takes, then the knight is hanging, right? So what to do here? There are a bunch of different candidate moves here. If we go step by step, taking the pawn, that would be the ideal solution, of course. But as you can see in this case, white would play rook b6, and they win material. We could try to play rook takes d5, getting rid of the other pawn. This has the advantage that the knight is now protected. Unfortunately, after rook d5, yeah, please notice that this is not a good idea due to knight f3. Also, black has a right to use tactical tricks in the tactical battle, so to speak. So what white will play here is the other threat. They will play rook d5. Why is this so strong? Well, it turns out that after king c7, yeah, we cannot take here, obviously. After king c7, what do you think white would play? That's right. A very, very important move here. The only move, I think, which can win the game is king f4. As you can see, the king is useful for creating this fork. This is a key observation. Later in this course, we will arrive at something which I call secret thinking. And this, you could say, it's secret thinking. We have noticed this idea from white. The king would like to go to f4 in this variation. And that's something that we can use. We can use this information in order to find the best move. So in the game, Arkell tried rook g1, which makes a lot of sense, a typical idea in the endgame, preparing a rear attack with a rook. Unfortunately, after rook d5, king e6, now the king must stay close to the knight. white prevented this move rook c1. I'm convinced that you know which move I'm talking about. Of course, Puranik played here rook c5, and black couldn't defend against this threat in any good way. So, all right, where does all this lead us then? We should perhaps have a look at one of those intermediate checks that we saw in the previous examples. Aha, there is actually only one. That's right. We should give this check on g3. In itself, it doesn't seem to accomplish anything, but if we look a little further, we can notice now that white's king is not having an ideal destiny. Going to f4 makes no sense because we could just go back, repeating. Going to d4 means that we are able to take the pawn with check. So white does not have time for this move rook b6 anymore. So white would have to play king d2 instead. And here we arrive in the other variation that we're talking about. Now we can safely take the pawn on g5 because after rook d5 check, king c7, white is missing this move, king f4. And for this reason, black is keeping the material balance, and most likely they will make a draw in this game. So not very simple, also perhaps not very difficult. What I think is that in time trouble, this was already about move 68 in the game. Most of us are very tired at that moment. I think Orkel was fighting for his life during most of the time, so it's perfectly understandable that this didn't come easy, no? This solution with rook g3, but very instructive, very interesting. Taking the pawn at once fails to this nice little fork with the king. The king is an attacking piece in the endgame, right? But if we include these two moves, rook g3 check, waiting for white to play king d2, then we can safely take the pawn because now white's king has been pushed away and they cannot rely on this idea anymore with king f4. So this shows us that intermediate moves, they're also very frequent in the endgame when we're defending in the endgame. I touched upon something of this in my course, my book, Mastering Endgame Strategy. I had a chapter about intermediate checks in rook endgames. All right, let's continue. If this was about the endgame, now let's have a look at something from the opening. We have this game with the white pieces is Grandmaster Gupta and playing black Grandmaster Sipke Ernst. This position, very short position, comes from the Janowski variation in the Queen's Gambit, where you play an early a6. As you can see, white is far ahead in development, and they have just played bishop c4, ignoring the threat at the knight, because they are attacking the pawn on f7. So this could end in a disaster for black if they're not careful. So how do you think black should react here? Should we just protect that pawn on f7, or is there anything else that we would like to do, perhaps? Aha, this is a critical situation, because if we take the knight straight away, we're not mated. As you can see, when white takes on f7, we will of course not go to d7, then we are getting mated. We will put our king on e7, so we're not mated. Also, we're not losing the queen, because they cannot play bishop g5. However, after the simple castles, it would be very difficult to play this position with black. White will go rook e1 next turn. Maybe they can take this pawn with the queen and so on. Complete nightmare for black. So this is not the right moment to take that knight on f3. We should not do it here. Any other move? Well, we could consider, of course, queen e7. Logical move, protecting the pawn and getting ready to trade queens, which would be a relief for black in this case. Even so, I think this has been played actually in practice. White could play something like knight e5, and after queen d4, check, bishop d2, queen takes, bishop takes. Still, as you can see, black would have some problems to solve here. White is a pawn down, but they have a dangerous initiative, and they can quickly bring in their pieces and continue fighting for an advantage. So what happened in the game was that Ernst noticed a very nice intermediate check. Well, there is only one check, so you know already which move I'm talking about, of course. Bishop b4, crazy move, you would say. Why on earth are they giving away the bishop like that? But it's simply a way of speeding up development. We will eventually take that knight, but first we should try to bring out the pieces. White took on b4, and at this point we don't want to take the knight. This is still a bad moment. White could simply castle and play rook e1. Whenever we have a piece on this diagonal, that means trouble for the opponent. They cannot castle here. This is a well-known restriction idea, known from Morpheus days. This kind of idea with putting a piece on a bishop or a queen on this diagonal. That's good to know. So what do you think Black played at this point? Well, if it's not taking the knight, it really has to be a forcing move, right? So of course they played here knight c6. So at this point things are a bit different, because now if white goes back with the queen, yeah, we definitely have to take now, else we will be a piece down. But here you can see that thanks to the bishop having left the house, we can now play king f8. That's a much better square, of course, for the king. It's much less exposed there. So this is already interesting for black. They would be threatening to take on d4 next turn, and white will have some problems with coordination with their pieces. So in the game, Gupta instead played queen a3, keeping the queen on this key diagonal a3, f8. So black hurried to take. After 2 intermediate moves, it was already a good moment to take the knight and get back into material equality. White castle, because if they take the pawn immediately, we could just castle ourselves and it would be like normal battle here. Black would be okay in this position. So in the game, they castled, and now what is black supposed to do with the king? This is something that at first sight looks very worrisome for black. Rook e1 is coming next. However, we should not forget that if most of the opponent's pieces or several pieces are lined up against our king side, we might consider queenside castling. So in the game, they played here instead queen takes d4. Very clever, because after rook e1, we could simply play bishop e6. Black is getting ready for queenside castles now. If white takes on e6, we could just take back and finally play king d7, and things would be more or less in order here. We could play like a artificial castling with rook e8 or rook d8 and then hide our king on c8. So in the game, Gupta played an interesting move here, bishop b5. This was a truly complex game, tactical complex game. What should black do now? It's not so nice to castle long anymore, because in that case white could take and the pawn on a6 would fall, right? However, there is a nice move here. Black can go for some kind of counterattack. So if we look a little at white's king also, we didn't talk so much about him, but do you think there is any way in which black could focus on white's king? Aha, we can go for mate here, queen g4. Very clever move. Now suddenly there is the threat of mate in one move, and no matter how white reacts, there is some kind of concession. Now they can play g3, but then perhaps we can play queen h3 and so on. They will have to move back the bishop and so on, or take the pawn, but even then, maybe then we can castle. So no matter how they react, we will gain something from it. Anyway, the most important part of this example is the very beginning, that please don't restrict yourself to moves like e takes f3 or queen e7. Look for other options also. Surprising move like bishop e4 turned out to be very strong. My piece of advice is to consider that whenever there are hanging pieces on the board, like in this case, the knight is hanging, that usually means that there is greater room for unusual moves, like forbidden moves, you could say, invisible moves, like bishop b4. So very nice idea here by Sipke Ernst. All right, we will continue. I wanted to show at least one example of the other group of intermediate moves, intermediate captures. I would say this is the least common group, but it's good to notice that this is also something that we can exploit in the everyday tactical battle. So let's have a look at this late middle game. Playing white is Isfan, and with the black piece is Philip. As you can see, white is having, I think, one pawn less, but there is a problem for black with the bishop on a6. It doesn't have many squares. I think white just played here knight to c5 probably. So what do you think we should do about that bishop? The obvious reaction here would be to just move it, and in that case we would have to go to b5. Unfortunately, in this case the bishop is getting completely trapped. It doesn't have any good squares anymore. What white could do here is using an intermediate moves themselves. They would like to take this pawn, but not now, because in that case black would take and they could then take the pawn with the bishop. So what would white play? Of course, they would first take on d8. After black takes back with the bishop or the rook, I think it's almost the same thing. White would take, and the bishop is completely doomed. So what happens here is simply that when you have this kind of tension, rooks placed on the open file, staring at each other, it's very important to try to figure out who is favored by trading at this or that moment. From a strategical perspective, you would say we should never trade, because in that case we give up the open file. But in a tactical perspective, that can have huge implications. So in this case, for example, it's very important for black to remove white's control of the c4 pawn, because that's how we're going to save this bishop. So for that reason, of course, you have already noticed the right move here. Black should take on d1. This is a typical intermediate capture. We first trade rooks, so that after rook takes d1, we are ready to play bishop b5. Now it's a bit different. This move is not making sense anymore. We could just take back. So what white would have to do here, they would have to try this move instead. And now, again, it looks a little tricky, no? What should we do with that bishop? Well, we can't really move it. Fortunately, we can use a counter threat here. So we can attack this knight. How can that be done? Well, this would be a good move, bishop e4, hitting the knight, so that if it moves, we could then move our bishop again. So probably what white should do here, they should instead take the bishop, and we will take their knight, and we will end up in some kind of complete equality here. White could take on c4, on c6, but yeah, probably on c4, so that we don't take on b3, and here you will have this kind of position which you could say it's complete draw, right? Opposite color bishops, and yeah, material equality. So a simple example of how we can use an intermediate capture in order to make life easier, to avoid tactical problems. So what black should do here, they should take on d1 and only then move the bishop to b5. If they fail in doing so, if they play bishop e5 straight away, it's white who will use exactly the same idea. They will take, and then they will play b takes e4, and in this case the bishop cannot really save its skin here. Okay, I think at this point we should continue looking at some intermediate threats. Here we have a nice example. I think this comes from the Italian, as you can see, or perhaps the Ruy Lopez it could also be, but probably the Italian, because I can't see any pawn on a6. Well, who knows? There are some Ruy Lopez variations like the Berlin where you don't play a6, so it could be either. In any case, as you can see here, we have a very sharp position. Black has just played g4. Black is trying to attack on the king side. This is a little dangerous, I would say, this policy of pushing the pawns in front of your king, but at the same time, it's a very common plan in the Italian nowadays. So how should white react to this threat? How to save that knight? You would say, where should I put this knight? But that's the wrong way of thinking. We should look at all options, not just knight moves because our knight is being attacked, or taking the pawn because we can take. Not always it will be the right choice to take something. So let's have a look here. We cannot go back with the knight. Then unfortunately our bishop is trapped. We could put the knight on h4. Then we don't have any problems with these pieces. On the other hand, black would take this pawn and they would have an extra pawn, and maybe it's not completely clear where white's compensation is. So in the game, white found a much nicer possibility. They could of course take also, but then black will take back, and yeah, possibly they are helped by clearing the h file. Could you then consider some kind of counter threat? Some intermediate threat before moving the knight? We could create our own threat. That's right. In this game with white Mamedov and black Paravian, Mamedov hurried to play here typical move bishop h4. Very clever, because in this way our bishop improves drastically, and also black has to make a concession here. Either they move away the queen, which means that the light squares are a bit weakened. On the other hand, if they play the dark squares. And if they play f6 instead, the light squares will be a bit weaker. So it's a very useful move. On top of it, you could say it also has the function of allowing the knight, the other knight, to come to g3, the typical Italian or Ruy Lopez knight maneuver. So very nice move by white, bishop h4. It doesn't win anything. It's a little more, you could say, strategy oriented. It's something that will help white's position. So in the game, Paravian replied f6. If queen e8 instead, there are at least two interesting options here. If you're a very brave player, you could consider this move, knight g3, about to take, and you have an interesting attack here if black takes on f3. But you could also play knight h2. Please notice that one move ago this was a bad mistake due to h4, but thanks to the inclusion of bishop h4 and after queen e8, now we can play this move, and there is no problem at all with white's minor pieces. As we were saying, this move is probably coming next, and we will be attacking that pawn on h5. For example, if black takes, we could hurry to bring the knight to the attack. All right, so after bishop h4, black played f6 instead, and white simply continued with the same move that we already discussed. So black took the opportunity to take this pawn. Their position is already a little suspicious, you could say, but in this way, at least they get a pawn. White played knight g3, targeting the pawn on h5. Black hurried to protect that pawn. And at this point, white decided to speed up their initiative. They played here knight f5. Sometimes when you check with chess engines and so on, they will not support this kind of moves. I don't remember what was the verdict in this case, but human-wise, it's often a very good idea to put as much pressure as possible on your opponent. So knight f5 check, very good move. After bishop takes, pawn takes, we can see that white is now controlling the open file. Knight e5 was played in the game. White avoided this little pitfall. C takes d4 would allow knight takes f4 and f5, sorry, and the bishop is attacked. So white found a nicer way of securing this bishop. What would you play at this point? Of course, speaking about strategy, we have a weak square on e6. That's what Mamedov played. Fantastic square for the bishop. White is down a pawn. They took on c3. White took back pawn down, but a very nice position for white. Black is very passive, and you can see that the king side is a little shaky. Later on, white went on to win this game with king h1 and f4. So, what was this example about? Basically, we were facing a threat, but we didn't move that piece which was threatened. We included first our own threat, which in one way or another improved our defensive chances, or well, you would say perhaps attacking chances. It's true, so it's not clear exactly who is attacking whom here. All right, let's check a similar example. Here we could see that the knight was being attacked, and in our next example, it's something very similar, because we're playing with the black pieces and white has just played g5. Very scary for black in this game between Cunha with the white pieces and Umetsubo playing black. How to save these two knights? These two knights. We cannot move one of them, and if we move the other one, we lose the knight on d7. So, wow. Very tricky, no? Very tricky. We can, of course, not take the bishop, because in that case we're dropping the rook on a8. Well, it cannot be knight move this time. We simply don't have a choice. We have to create a threat of our own. And this is more like, you could say, an indirect threat. I just said that we cannot take because the rook is hanging. So that means that if the rook is not on the a file, then we could indeed take the bishop, right? So now you know in which direction to look here. You're right, we should move that rook. In the game, black understood this idea and they played the move rook d8. The idea is excellent. They would like to trade the knight on f6 for the bishop on b5. But there is a little, well, not that little actually, there is a big flaw with this idea. It's a very beautiful idea. We talked about non-captures as one of the, what can I say, obstacles in the thought process when we are calculating the human thought process. What happened here is that after g takes f6, a takes b5, knight takes b5, queen b4, this looks at first sight as if black is going to equalize here, because after queen takes, bishop takes, as you can see, black would be doing fine. They could later on take this pawn and so on. However, there is a non-capture here. After queen b4, imagine what white could play here. Aha, you're right. White could actually play this pretty move, bishop d2. Not a common picture, I would say, this mate. After queen takes a4, black is mated in a funny way, thanks to this little pawn on f6, some kind of smothered mate. So yeah, that's not what happened in the game, because after rook d8, Cunha with the white pieces, after g takes f6, a takes b5, he played instead f takes d7. I guess both players simply didn't notice this hidden possibility for white, sorry. And after bishop takes g7, knight takes b5, queen e7, black was perfectly fine here. On the other hand, if we stick to this idea of moving the rook, and at the same time we remember that there is some danger with a check on c7, you of course know which move we're talking about. That's right, we can play here rook c8. As simple as that. Now we have responded to this threat with our own threat, a takes b5. What could happen here? Well, now this is not so impressive anymore. We could just continue after g takes f6, a takes b5. We would, after knight takes b5, just trade queens on b4. As you can see, there is no trace of a mate anymore. We can take or we can move the king in that case. So after bishop, queen takes b4, bishop takes b4, black would be perfectly fine. We could just take back very soon the pawn on f6. So in the game, sorry, in our main line, I mean, this didn't happen in the game, white would take on g6 first, so that after h takes g6, they could take on f6. If they don't play like that, if they move the bishop somewhere, yeah, that gives us a moment to move our knight somewhere. I guess to d5 would be the best square here. And as you can see, of course, if bishop takes d7, we're very happy to take back with the knight, and in this way we have avoided the threat at our knight on f6. So after g takes f6, black will take on b5, and we're back on the same story again. Knight takes b5, queen b4. We're happy to trade queens here. Queen takes b4, bishop takes b4, bishop d2 perhaps, bishop takes, king takes, and we should not run into this fork, of course, so we could play something like castling, and after f takes d7, king takes d7, we would have completely equal endgame, or perhaps even a tiny bit better for black due to this pawn on d4. So that's what this example is about. White had played g5, dangerous threat of g takes f6. We could not put our knight anywhere because there is also a threat against the other knight. But with this smart move, rook c8, unpinning the pawn on a6, we're able to keep the balance here. Let's continue. In our next example, we will see something about looking at the whole board, and also we will see something about non-recaptures. This is a difficult example, and it's one of those that we can really learn from. So let's see if we can understand this together. White has sacrificed a pawn, but you can see they have very nice compensation in this isolated queen's pawn structure. The square on f5, that's a great stronghold for white. You can see that black is not so happy about these pawn moves on the king side, I mean that move in particular. And on top of it, the knight on a2 is far away from home, and it's even exposed to tactical threats like queen b2, queen b1, and so on. So how to continue here? What should we do here? White has just played bishop f5, I think. We can definitely not take. In that case, white will take back, and there will be multiple threats here in this position, even some idea with knight e7. If black tries to trade queens, for example, we would take and then win the rook here. So that's completely out of the question. In the game, by the way, Petrosyan, Manuel with the white pieces, and Hajrapetyan playing black. In the game, Hajrapetyan played here rook e8. Unfortunately, this allowed white to carry out a very nice tactical idea. We're speaking about looking at the whole board, which is the piece which can act on the whole board in the most powerful way. Of course, the queen, that's what Petrosyan noticed here. He took on e6, and after f takes e6, there is a very nice move here. That's right. We can work in two completely different places of the board at the same time with a pretty retreating move, queen b1. As you can see, the knight is attacked, and at the same time, queen g6 is coming. Bad news for black. After knight c3, queen g6, we cannot interpose because the rook is hanging, and we have to move the king. And then I think they took and they brought in more pieces to the attack. Complete nightmare. White went on to win here. So what to do then? Well, there was another way to play here. Rook e8 was designed to protect the bishop on e6. However, we can actually temporarily let them take there and take back later. We have to prepare an intermediate threat. So how can that be done? you're right, we should use the knight for that purpose. Knight c3, very, very difficult, let me say that, for the human to see such moves, which is why I think we can learn a lot from the computers when it comes to the tactical battle. If white now takes with the bishop on e6, we are happy to take back. And as you can see, white can of course take back with the queen, but then it would just be material equality. They can definitely not take in this way because black would play rook c6 and troubles on the sky for white. The only way I think to save the knight would be by queen d8 check, but in that case, as you can see, the knight is perhaps trapped here. I'm not sure, maybe something like that, and bringing in the king. In any case, this is not what white wants here. So after knight c3, the most critical move will be the other capture. White will take like that instead. Sorry, with the knight, I mean, so that we can take back with the bishop and give check and threaten the rook at the same time. So this looks like a complete tactical oversight, but we have actually reached the key moment of this example. Please tell me, how should black proceed here? Which is the intermediate move that will save their skin? That's right. We can use our knight in order to deflect white's queen from the tactical battle. A very surprising idea. Not easy to see this at the board, even if you have a lot of time. Knight a4, as you can see, white cannot keep in touch with this knight anymore. They will have to move the queen to some inferior square, like for example queen d4. And we can just take back now on e6. They cannot really profit from this situation. If they take, we take back, and yeah, there are not so many pieces left on the board, so black should be perfectly fine despite a somewhat shaky pawn structure. So probably white should take back instead. Bishop takes e6, the desperate piece, right? We take something before we say goodbye to that piece. Queen takes e6, queen takes a4. White appears to be still a tiny bit better, but after a move like rook c4, black could get ready to play queen c6 and perhaps try to trade rooks. Probably black would be quite okay here. They are happy that there are not more pieces on the board. So admittedly, a very difficult example, very difficult for us humans to spot such ideas, such as knight c3 followed by knight a4. But yeah, such a little tactical trick can really change the picture completely. So very important idea, knight c3, and if knight takes e6, knight a4, the non-recapture, that's definitely one of the most challenging areas in the tactical battle. Let's continue. We have another example here coming up. I wanted to also mention that one of the ideas that we can use within intermediate threats is the threat of mate. That's a very useful threat, of course. It's a very forcing threat. So that's what we're going to see in our next example. Here you can see typical Sicilian battle. Both sides are playing for an attack. White on the king side on the h-file, and black is also very close to white's king on b1. So this is a very tense position. You can see that white is right now a piece up, but actually material is not that important here. What's important is who is arriving first with their mating attack. So let's see what's going on. White would like to take on f6. In that case, we have the concrete threat of mate on g7, and at the same time, if black takes back after bishop takes f6, white would take on h7, of course. So it's clear that black should try to do something on their side. Also, white is a piece up, so black should definitely look for a counterattack. But how can they carry out a counterattack? One move that I thought about was if we could take on b2 like this. So that after king takes, we would play queen a3. At first sight, this looks very promising, because if we go back with the king to a1, rook c2 would be very strong. I would say in general terms, whenever you have the chance to create two mating threats at the same time, that's usually very promising. It's difficult for the opponent to defend against both of them, right? However, after king takes b2, queen a3, white would rather play king b1 instead. And the difference now is that black is denied this move. Yeah, if you play it anyway, I'll take it and I'll just run away with my king. We can use the brave king here. In some way, we will sneak away with the king. So what black could try to do here, of course, after, let's see here, king b1, they could play b3, trying to get at white's king. However, we talked briefly, I think, in my game versus Schulman, we talked about the usage of a rook on the second rank, or the seventh rank for black. And this idea can be used by white here. They must play, I think, this move, rook d2. Very important move. In this case, they keep track of the a2 pawn, and I think white is winning here, because if you give check, I think I can just hide in the corner, and I should be grateful to my knight that there is no check on c3, and also our queen is soon coming back. So yeah, that should be completely winning, but interesting idea, definitely something to check in the first place. What else? Well, we could of course take on e2 first, get rid of that knight, that defending knight. However, after bishop takes f6, if we now stick to the same idea as we talked about already, white has concrete threats here, so black's moves, they all have to come with check, basically. So if we start now with a mating attack, or perhaps perpetual attack, rook c2 check after rook takes b2, king takes b2, white will take again on c2. Right now they have a lot of extra material, queen takes a2. This is the same story as we just talked about. White will simply bring the king to the opposite side, king d3, and the king sooner or later will hide on this side. But the idea itself, it's good. The idea is good to take and try to attack on the second rank. However, we should use a little intermediate move. Speaking of which, very often, or quite often, intermediate moves, they are affected by pawns. Pawns are good with this, and here we have an example. You got it. We should start with the move b3. This move is mainly designed to open up some more space for black's queen. So also we have the concrete threat of mating 1. That's why I'm saying that this is an intermediate move. We will take on e2, but first we will use this mating threat to make our queen a little stronger in the attack. So white will have to take back on b3. They cannot play a3. This is a typical Sicilian pattern that every Sicilian player knows about. Of course, we can now sacrifice on b2 after a3, rook takes b2. King takes, we will bring in the rook to c2, and this is going to end with mate, because after king b1, queen takes a3. Unfortunately, white doesn't have any forcing move, and at the same time, we have the situation that I talked about. We have two mating threats at the same time, and that's just too much for white to handle. So after b3, white will have to play a takes b3 instead. And now we can simply rely on the previous variation. Now we can take on e2, and after bishop takes f6, as you can see, we had the same position in the other line. It was like this, but now we don't have that pawn anymore obstructing our queen. We're back in the main line. And this means that we can now use the queen in a smarter way. Of course, rook takes b2, and after king takes b2, we don't have to sacrifice a rook. We can now use our queen instead. Queen c3 check is already white, who should be a little careful here. They will have to keep track of this pawn. So, for example, king a2, we have two checks, but it's easy to see that the best check has to be this one, so that we can give check next turn. We shouldn't give check there, because then white escapes the check, right? So queen c2, white could try king a3, but we can give check again, queen c5. We have enough checks here with the queen. By the way, later on in this course, there will be a chapter about perpetuals. I think it's chapter 5, possibly, where we will see this kind of situation quite a lot. So b4, we could just play queen c3. King a4, we can play queen c6, and it's impossible for white to escape this perpetual. So the game will end in a draw. And this is actually exactly how black proceeded in this game. By the way, I forgot to tell you the names of the players. Playing white, Iranian Grandmaster Tabatabai, and with the black pieces, Grandmaster from Georgia, Mchedlishvili. And Mchedlishvili found this whole sequence. He played here the move that we're talking about, b3. So very clever move. Again, whenever you have this kind of sharp tactical situation, don't rule out any moves. Don't forget about moves as this one, b3, which creates some kind of threat that can make a huge difference. Here, the mating threat of queen takes a2 allowed black to use their queen in a more powerful way. All right, I think we have arrived at our last example in this chapter. This, contrary to the other positions, it's a position that didn't occur in the game. With white pieces, Abdusattorov versus Salem, very strong grandmasters, and it didn't happen in the game, but I thought it was a very interesting position because black sacrificed a whole piece in order to start an attack. You can see that the rook on e6 is about to reach h6, after which there would be the strong threat of queen h3. You could say white's rook, in a way, it's not placed in an ideal position because we cannot reach g2 with the queen, which would have been great for that purpose of covering the h1 square. So how do you think white should proceed here? Is there any way of saving the situation here? We don't want to sacrifice on g3, for example. That would be very high price to pay here, because also the bishop would be hanging, right? So white has an extra piece, but the attack, black's attack, is very troublesome. One move you could consider, of course, bishop f5, trying to trade off pieces, but black has no reason to take. That would be insane because it would just help white to trade more pieces. So, of course, black would play rook h6, and again we have this situation. Another move that I thought about was to bring the knight to help the defense, to take the pawn on g3. Well, unfortunately, black could carry out this idea, which I call trading the defender. We will come to that later, I think in chapter 19, possibly, attacking method, second part. Bishop takes e2, very strong move, because after that we are ready to resume the idea of giving mate. No matter how white takes back, for example, with the queen, we could play here rook h6. Maybe you noticed that there is this intermediate move. That's the topic that we're talking about, right? Unfortunately, after queen h4, black would still be much better in this position. White is still in trouble here with rook h6 coming up. Also, there is something hanging on d4, I think, and on top of it, the rook is also hanging, so not so nice for white. All right, very difficult to see a way how to save white, and I also wanted to mention that the best move here, it isn't really an intermediate move, because we were saying that an intermediate move, it could be defined as a move that is played before another more obvious move. But in this case, our second move, it can actually not be played at this point. It's not available at this point. But still, it's somehow the same kind of pattern. We're looking for a move, a forcing move, which will give us some extra possibility later on. We're not winning anything. We are just inserting some little move which will improve our chances. So which move do you think that is? Well, it has to be a forcing move, as we were saying. Capture, check, or threat. In this case, it has to be a check, and here we go, bishop h7. Very surprising. In this way, we're giving back a piece in order to save our king. Giving back material, we will come to that also later in the course. Chapter 13, I think. Well, I might be mistaken. You can check the chapter list. Bishop h7. If black now takes on h7, we will, of course, trade queens, and we're very happy to reach an endgame here. Queen takes h7, king takes h7, and rook takes g3, I was going to say, but it seems rook takes f7 is even stronger. Then we can take this pawn next turn, and white would be okay here, even if at this point they're down one pawn. No, they're down one pawn, but they will get a pawn, 2 pawns, but they will get 1 pawn, and they're fairly active here. So after bishop h7, we should, of course, have a look at what happens if black plays king h8, ignoring our threat. So why this move bishop h7? What was it good for? Was it just like some last desperate check, or was there some point with this move? Well, to understand this, you have to compare this position with that position, the initial position. So what do you think? What is the difference here? What does it mean that the bishop traveled all the way to h7? Does it have to do with the bishop, or does it have to do with some other white piece? That's right, it has to do with some other piece. Aha, the queen can now use this square. Very deep idea, but once you see it, it's evident. No? In this way, white is able to get at the g3 pawn. Now, if black continues with their plan, this will backfire. We will just take on g3, and they only have this check left, and we will escape. We're happy they don't have this check on f6 and so on. So that's the point here. Queen d3, very clever move. At this point, black should rather go for that endgame that we just talked about. They should just take on h7. And for us, the simplest choice would be to take again. And we're back in the variation that we just talked about. Rook takes f7, that's the healthiest pawn. I guess if we take the other pawn, black will have a chance to play something like bishop h5, and yeah, in this way they keep a passed pawn on the g file, for example. So yeah, difficult example, very difficult. Again, my message is that we should not rule out this kind of moves when we have a difficult situation on the board. That might be the move. When the normal moves, when the natural moves, such as, for example, bringing pieces to the defense, trading off the opponent's attacking pieces, or trying to get at his pawn, things like that, when they don't succeed, it's time to look for more unusual solutions, such as in this case, giving away a bishop, giving back the bishop in order to enable this little move, queen d3. So that's what intermediate moves are about. Let's have a quick recap. Let's go from the beginning. We started with this example. We saw that before taking the rook, black should give check, so that when white goes back with the king, we can take, and in the very end, we will go back with our queen and we will pick up the bishop. In our second example, we saw that white could simply safeguard this bishop with tempo by carrying out these checks, and only after that they would be ready to move away the rook. In this way they would avoid this tactical trick with queen d3. In the next example, we saw in the endgame that black could have saved this difficult endgame, but only if they rely on this check on g3. Again, my message would be that whenever you have this kind of situation on the board, don't rule out moves like rook g3, even if they don't appear to have any clear benefit. You have to dig a little further and try to understand. Don't forget about such moves. Rook g3 had the benefit of pushing away white's king from the important f4 square. We had a look at this example from the opening, the Janowski variation, where black, instead of taking the knight, they took the opportunity to give this intermediate check, bishop b4, and only after white took on b4, they played knight c6, and only after that they were ready to take back when their king was no longer in such big danger. We had a look at this intermediate capture, very typical situation when there are two rooks, for example. It can happen in many different contexts, but this is a common one. Two rooks on the open file. We should, at every move, try to establish who is favored by trading those rooks. In this case, it was black who was favored by trading, because in this way they were able to save their bishop now that b takes e4 was not so strong anymore, since the rook had left, and after instead a4, black would have this intermediate threat, by the way. Speaking of which, intermediate threats, in our next example, we saw that white, after g4, didn't move the knight. They included an intermediate threat. Instead, they played bishop h4, which gave them new possibilities and also improved the bishop. In our next example, we saw that g5 was very troublesome for black. They were looking for a way to save their knights, and the best way of doing that was by removing the rook from the a file, playing rook c8, so that suddenly white's bishop would be in the air. If white takes, then black will also take, and that would not be a threat anymore. We saw in the next example that by this nice knight maneuver, black would be able to deflect white from the very important e6 square. That was the most difficult case, if you ask me. We had another example where we saw the inclusion of b3 in order to speed up black's attack. And finally, in our last example, we saw the usage of the move bishop h7 check in order to get our queen a little further closer to the action. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.